of owning a cafe and other heroic deeds by Beware the Tistero. Chapter 109, Saturday, Part 13. Dismissing Watanabe with a gesture, Todoroki Enji sat in the chair he'd been afforded before sipping at the wheat tea he'd asked for, his uninterested gaze sweeping the dojo once again. With Shoto having won his match, and all three brats stowed away in some kind of winner's area, this meant that his staff wouldn't need to supervise them. For a change. He couldn't remember ever being so needy in his youth. Similarly, he didn't drain his parents' resources to the extent that the three of them did either, because ensuring his successor had the best possible diet wasn't exactly cheap, was it? Plus, the other two had to eat as well, which meant, of course, he'd ended up employing a cook. The man was highly skilled and agreed to work long hours at least. The tutors he'd brought in, too, were expensive. They were the kind who simply did their jobs, no questions asked, though. And that was something a man of his fame prized above most things, especially since he supposed the boy and girl needed career prospects too. He'd allow them to dwell in the Musutafu house until they were old enough to attend a university somewhere, of course, and since he'd end up being an executor of any student loans they might need, he may as well fund their classes, materials, and modest lodgings, hadn't he? This way, at least, they wouldn't be completely useless. Then there was Rei to consider. Osakawa was a private facility whose fees seemed to grow with every passing year. However, paying such extortionate sums to keep her quietly tucked away was far better than the scandal of her instability getting out. He couldn't have her madness tarnishing his good name. Nor could he risk the bastard press catching wind of it. If anyone even dared to question his heir's mental faculties or his right to enter UA under recommendation, then there'd be hell to pay. And speaking of which, as he swallowed the last mouthful of the drink, his gaze finally alighting upon that runty upstart night-eye was no doubt fucking. He was even walking with the lean Strigopists right now, their smarmy forms, accompanied by one of the future seer's pet projects. How demeaning. How disgusting. How ridiculous! To think that criminals should be rehabilitated. To believe such scum could dare to enter the ranks of pro-heroes. It made him furious, and he just fucking knew that Yagi was behind this simpering snowflake generation appeasing scheme too. Puffing at a breath through his nostrils, twin flames momentarily appearing, he calmed his ire, crushed his bottle, and flicked it at one of the attendants. He was the main attraction of this pitiful event, after all, which meant he didn't have to deal with any mess. No, he'd just make a mess of the competition, and, with any luck at all, well, he'd be ducking that smug, dark-haired son of a bitch, and, if possible, he'd be putting him in the hospital for a good long while. Chuckling to himself, his arms folding imperiously over his chest, Enji allowed a cruel little smirk to curl up his face when he finally made eye contact with the gutter snipe.
Oi,
he grunted, another one of the dojo's staff hurrying over at his bark.
The man who opened up the event, what was his name again?
All of the competitors aren't listed on the program. Todoroki-sama. The half-wit stammered, her hands rapidly flicking through the pamphlet he'd discarded earlier. Here we are. Aizawa Shouta, she stated. He's a 7th grade black belt in jiu-jitsu, and, he's associated with Moto Shisho's dojo. He's a sensei himself, too. Would you like me to pass on a message?
Yes.
He cut through with an annoyed grunt, their eyes still locked from across the area.
Tell him that we have unfinished business.
He snapped.
Business that I look forward to dealing with today.
If he'd looked less than unimpressed by the message he'd been given, then he truly hoped the yawn he let out upon hearing it had really sealed the deal. And I've just added threatening a civilian to his arrest warrant. His golden-eyed friend murmured next to him whilst Atsuhiro chuffed. It's days like today that almost make me regret my trek down this straight and narrow road, so to speak. He said, a gloved hand resting on his shoulder. Good luck, my friend. The tournament should be over in about 2 hours, and then we can all to you for a well-deserved celebration. Can't we? Smiling at the brunette, he nodded at both of them as they were ushered away from the competitors' area by the dojo staff, their bodies moving to the strategically placed seats in the tiered area overlooking the arena alongside 10 police force officers with capture-based quirks, Toshinori, Keigo, and 2 other pro heroes. Kyuri Kruga, too, was stood behind and to the left of Endeavor in her role as Watanabe. All of the nannies were now in police custody, with many giving damning testimony in a vain attempt to save their own skins. Being an accomplice to the seemingly ever-growing list of atrocities alleged against the soon-to-be former pro came with pretty hefty sentences otherwise. A part of him railed against any of the bastards getting some kind of leniency. However, when Kenji-san had relayed a few details about the people employed by Enji, some of his anger had died. The house staff were all being blackmailed in one way or another. The housekeeper was a gambler who nearly lost her house. Todoroki had generously paid off her debt in exchange for loyalty and tight lips. 2 of the nannies were illegal immigrants. Todoroki had paid for their papers. The whole thing stank of modern slavery. And so on and so on. God, the more he heard about the bastard and how he manipulated those around him, the more he found himself agreeing with Atsuhiro. Dealing with this abusive piece of shit legally had cost a boatload of yen and almost immeasurable heartache. But that's why doing everything properly and out in the open is so important. Beating him senseless would make us as bad as him. That kind of revenge could potentially set the prick up as a martyr who would be seen as the victim of an attack he'd not deserved. So come on, be patient. He mentally chastised himself. It's almost over. What? What the fuck did you do to get the Todoroki's dick out, man? Blinking, Shouta turned his head to the side. No offense, but a little guy like you must have done something pretty fucking epic to rile him up, right? And up and up until he met the face of a man who wasn't new to getting his nose broken. Damn! His size and stature was similar to his fiancée's, only this brunette was somehow bulkier. His musculature didn't seem to sit right across his frame. He looked as though he ate steroids for breakfast, iron girders for lunch, and kept everything off with protein shakes. From what I understand, he replied evenly, his shoulders offering a little shrug. It doesn't take much to piss him off, does it? Aha! And bam, brother! The ragged gi-wearer snickered. The name's Rapakendo! He offered with a nod. Aizawa Shouta, he replied in kind, his head similarly inclining politely, his eyes momentarily tracking to the dais of judges as they arrived, his feet moving to take a seat. Say, Aizawa, you don't mind me hanging out with you while we get the show on the road, right? His steps dogged by the slightly younger man, who, despite him not having a chance to answer, plonked himself right down beside him upon one of the floor cushions that had been provided. Sure, he mused, his tone flat. Be my guest. After 5 minutes, the judges declared their expectations of the combatants and the decorum they were certain would rule over the matches, and announced the brackets. Oh, yes! I'm so fucking pumped for this! As it turned out, his new friend would be facing Todoroki straight off the bat. I hear he's pretty tough, but I'm pretty sure I can whoop his ass, you know? With him being over 30 and all. The other stage whispered to him in a volume closer to a loudly conversational one, his excitement palpable as the people sat behind them murmured about rudeness. So, Peach, you got any advice for me? Jack Langdon smiled himself, Shonen nodded, whilst the other participants whispered amongst themselves as the first 2 masters approached the stage. You're relatively evenly matched, I think, in terms of size, and since this is a quirkless contest, I'd advise you to go for his legs. He offered, the other blinking those beady eyes at him, those patchy brows reaching for his waving airline. His legs! He repeated owlishly. Why? Thinking about his preferred fighting style logically, Todoroki tends to throw the majority of his skill and power into his upper body. I have a feeling that he has a quirk which allows him to fly in some capacity because most people with a flame-based quirk tend to use it in such a way. He furthered mildly. Therefore, if he sees his legs as secondary, rationality dictates that he not prioritize using them. he mused as the other gawped at him.
It's just a theory, though, so perhaps it's best for you to feel him out first. I'd go for his legs as a secondary tactic if you feel it's necessary.
Wow, Teach! That's a pretty solid reasoning! The taller, browner man grinned, the expression fierce as he slammed his fists together in front of him. I was sure to keep that in mind, you know? His first match saw him going up against a woman with a scorpion mutation. The barbed end of her tail had been wrapped up in quirk restrictive material, and the 2 additional arms, which sprouted from her side, each ending in wicked-looking pincers, had been similarly secured. Hajime! She was somewhere in her late 30s. Her technique was impeccable, the accuracy of her strikes true. Ha! However, it was clear from the second that she'd launched herself at him that she'd tried to deal with him quickly because she wasn't used to fighting with 2 of her limbs restricted. This, of course, set her off balance, which led to mistakes. That enabled him to tackle her, pin her struggling form to the mat, and subdue her in one of the more complex holds of his discipline, the clutch he'd secured her arms in having to tighten when she thrashed like a person possessed. 2! If she could use her pinchers, he was pretty sure that she'd be foisting him off and tearing at him. 3! Aizawa Shouta advances! Damn, it was a bloody good thing this was a competition, wasn't it?
Thank you for an excellent match.
And so, with a relieved huff, he pulled himself to a stand and offered a hand to his fallen opponent. Jiu-jitsu is really something, Aizawa-kun, she complimented with a grin. It certainly did a number on these old bones, you know. Your takedown was ruthless.
It was an honor to fight you, Snappa-san. I'd very much enjoy a rematch at another time,
he replied courteously, the pair of them bowing before they made their way off of the stage in opposite directions, a smile tilting his lips when one of the attendants passed him a bottle of water and a neck towel. As he took them, he slanted a look at a thoroughly unimpressed-looking Enji, his smile quipping a little more. I'm one step closer to you now, you son of a bitch, he thought before making his way to where an almost starry-eyed Rappa was awaiting him, that meaty hand rapidly petting his floor cushion. If all of the bouts would end so quickly, then they could be bagging Todoroki before 3 p.m., which would mean he could be with his cafe community by 4. Now wasn't that a lovely thought? When the bulky young man had snapped him a salute, rolled those massive shoulders, and jagged towards the arena floor, Shouta had felt a little conflicted. Fighters ready? For there were 2 possible outcomes they'd initially planned for when it came to arresting the asshole strutting his way into the ring today. Yosh! The first depended on the prick winning. After the fanfare, most of the competitors and civilians would be making their way out of the Budokan. Therefore, as he moved to leave, he'd be confronted by Kenji-san, the pros, and capture quirk specialists with him within sight, his eraser ready to activate. That way, that fucker would be arrested in the open air in full view of the martial arts masters who'd been involved since the plan's conception, and if all went well, he'd be led into reinforced prison transport with quirk-suppressing cuffs and shipped off to Tartarus for processing. Ha! Bring it, Grandpa! However, something was telling him it wouldn't be that easy, that they'd end up having to subdue him, that his ego and shock would equal a flame-spent attention. Hajime! Which meant, of course, that things would get messy, that people could potentially get hurt. And the first person to get injured from the look of things was Rappa Kendo. Regarding the meaty, disheveled mess who'd been talking Aizawa's ear off for the past 10 minutes or so, Todoroki Enji knew exactly what he wanted to do. Fighters ready? Since needing the little runt in the ring might not happen in the first few rounds of it all, well, yes! He could teach the brawny punk who seemed so enamored by him a thing or two, couldn't he? Ha! Bring it, Grandpa! Grandpa! Hajime! Snarling, he wasted no time in punting the cocky little shit right in his crooked face with a right hook. Before slamming another strong left-handed punch into that muscle-coated gut. The overgrown punk would be sobbing by the time he'd finished with him. Blinking, his guard not lowered for a second, Enji felt his frown deepen into a sneer as the brunette let out a low wolfish chuckle whilst wiping a smear of blood away from his mouth with a grotesque long tongue. More! More! Come on! He howled before rushing at him at full tilt. I knew you wouldn't let me down!